Pam Bondi adjusted her sunglasses as she stepped out of the black car that had just dropped her off at the airport entrance. The sky above was clear, a brilliant blue stretching endlessly over the sprawling airport, where people bustled around, pulling luggage, checking phones, hurrying to their gates. She took a deep breath, tightening her grip on the sleek leather handle of her carry-on bag. This was supposed to be a smooth flight, a comfortable trip in business class, nothing more than a few hours in the air before she landed at her destination. The ticket was already booked, first-class service, priority boarding, a quiet, stress-free journey. Or so she thought. As she walked through the automated glass doors, the cool rush of air conditioning greeted her, replacing the warmth of the Florida sun outside. The check-in area was spacious, gleaming under bright lights, and filled with the usual symphony of airport sounds, murmuring voices, rolling suitcases. The occasional announcement crackling through the speakers. Pam navigated through the crowd with practiced ease, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the check-in counter. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your ticket and ID?" the airline representative asked with a polite but professional smile. Pam slid her ticket and passport across the counter. The woman scanned them quickly, nodding in approval. "You're all set, Ms. Bondi. Your gate is B12, boarding in 35 minutes. Enjoy your flight." Pam thanked her and made her way toward security, weaving through passengers and airport staff. The process was seamless. TSA agents barely glanced at her as she passed through the checkpoint. No alarms, no delays. Soon, she was walking down the carpeted terminal, past shops and restaurants, their neon signs glowing invitingly. But she had no interest in a last-minute meal or browsing overpriced duty-free items. She just wanted to reach her gate, board her flight, and settle into the plush comfort of business class. When she arrived at B12, she checked the digital display overhead. Her flight was on time. Good. She found a seat near the boarding area and pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails, responding to a few messages. The minutes ticked by. Passengers slowly began gathering, some standing impatiently, others sitting quietly with headphones or books. Then came the first announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin boarding for Flight 247 in just a few moments. First class and business class passengers, as well as those requiring additional assistance, will be invited to board first." Pam stood, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder, and walked toward the boarding line. A uniformed airline employee scanned her ticket, nodded, and gestured for her to proceed. She stepped down the jet bridge, feeling the familiar excitement of travel, the anticipation of takeoff. The entrance to the aircraft was just ahead. She stepped inside. The scent of clean upholstery and recirculated air hit her immediately. The flight attendants stood near the door, smiling as they greeted passengers. "Welcome aboard." Pam nodded politely and proceeded down the narrow aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin. The business class section was nearly empty. Only a few seats were occupied so far. She quickly located hers, a window seat, just as she preferred. Sliding her carry-on into the overhead compartment, she settled in, smoothing her skirt as she relaxed into the comfortable leather seat. She exhaled, allowing herself a moment to unwind. Soon, the flight attendants would begin their usual rounds, offering drinks, checking tickets, ensuring passengers were settled. She glanced out the small window, watching the ground crew move efficiently below. It was a routine she had experienced countless times. There was no reason to expect anything unusual. She had no idea what was about to unfold. Pam Bondi adjusted herself in her seat, reaching for the in-flight magazine tucked into the seat pocket in front of her. She flipped through the glossy pages absent-mindedly, her mind elsewhere. The cabin was still relatively empty, the quiet hum of the aircraft filling the space as passengers slowly trickled in. A flight attendant, dressed in a crisp uniform, moved through the aisle with a professional air, checking overhead compartments and ensuring everything was in place before takeoff. Pam barely paid attention to her as she turned another page in the magazine. Then, she heard footsteps stop beside her. She glanced up. The flight attendant, a woman with sharp features and dark eyes, was standing right beside her seat, looking down at her with an expression that was hard to read. Pam gave her a polite smile, expecting the usual pre-flight routine. Instead, the woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she tilted her head. "Pam Bondi." The tone was neutral, almost questioning, but there was something about the way she said it that made Pam pause for just a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, that's me," she answered, still smiling, assuming the woman had recognized her from television or political events. That wasn't unusual. People often did. But before she could say anything else, the flight attendant's entire demeanor shifted. Her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a tight line, and then, without warning, she raised her voice. "Get out." Pam blinked, caught completely off guard. "Excuse me," she asked, her smile faltering as she sat up straighter. The woman's voice rose, sharper now, cutting through the soft murmurs of the few passengers who had already taken their seats. "I said, get out. You're not welcome on this flight." A stunned silence stretched between them for a moment. Pam's heart began to pound as she processed what had just been said. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice still calm but laced with confusion. Around her, other passengers had begun to take notice, heads turning, whispers starting to ripple through the cabin. The flight attendant's stance was rigid, her expression unwavering. "We don't serve Republicans on this flight. You need to leave." The words hit Pam like a slap. Her mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. Was this some kind of joke? A misunderstanding? No, the woman's glare told her otherwise. The hostility in her voice was real. Pam felt a flicker of panic deep in her chest, but she pushed it down, keeping her composure. "That's ridiculous," she said, forcing a small, incredulous laugh, hoping this was just a bizarre overreaction. "I bought a ticket like everyone else. I have a right to be here." But the flight attendant wasn't backing down. If anything, her stance became even more rigid, her voice even more forceful. "You need to leave. Now." Pam glanced around the cabin, searching for someone, another attendant, a fellow passenger, anyone, who might intervene, who might confirm that this was completely out of line. But the other flight attendants were lingering near the front of the plane, whispering amongst themselves, casting quick glances her way. And the passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, others just watched with wary curiosity, unsure of what to do. Her breath hitched slightly. This wasn't just one rogue employee. There was something larger happening here. She turned back to the woman, her voice firm now. "I'm not going anywhere. I paid for this seat, and I intend to stay in it." The flight attendant's eyes flashed with something unreadable, and then, without hesitation, she reached up and pressed a button on the overhead panel. A chime sounded through the cabin, and within seconds, 2 uniformed security personnel appeared at the entrance of the plane. Pam's pulse skyrocketed. This wasn't just an argument anymore, this was escalating into something serious. The flight attendant gestured toward her. "She refuses to leave. Remove her." The officers stepped forward, their presence heavy, their gazes unreadable. Pam felt her breath catch. "Wait a minute," she said quickly, lifting her hands in a calm but defensive gesture. "This is insane. I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers didn't hesitate. One of them reached for her arm. She jerked away instinctively, her heart hammering now. "Hey, don't touch me." "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone flat, rehearsed, "you need to deplane immediately." Pam stared at them, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't legal. She felt a rush of anger flare up, overriding the shock. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice stronger now. "Because she doesn't like my politics?" The flight attendant folded her arms, her expression unbothered. "You're disturbing other passengers." Pam let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "I was sitting quietly in my seat until you came over and started this nonsense." She turned to the other passengers, searching for support. "You all saw that, right? This is absurd." Some of them looked away. Others exchanged nervous glances. No one said anything. The security officers weren't waiting for her to plead her case. One of them took a step closer. "Ma'am, if you do not comply, we will be forced to remove you." Pam's pulse thundered in her ears. She knew she was outnumbered. Knew they wouldn't listen to reason. But the unfairness of it, the sheer audacity, burned through her like fire. She clenched her jaw, breathing hard, forcing herself to stay in control. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. She slowly reached for her bag, her hands trembling with barely restrained fury. "Fine," she spat, standing up, shoving past the flight attendant as she stepped into the aisle. "But you better believe I'm not letting this go." The woman smirked slightly, as if satisfied, as Pam stormed toward the exit. The moment she stepped off the plane, she yanked out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen as she dialed. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a violation. And she was going to make damn sure everyone knew about it. Pam Bondi's pulse pounded in her ears as she clutched her phone tightly in her hand, her fingers white from the pressure. She turned sharply, her heels clicking against the jet bridge floor as she faced the flight attendant who had just humiliated her in front of an entire cabin full of passengers. Her breath was unsteady, not from fear but from rage, a white-hot fury that burned beneath her skin. "Tell me," she said, her voice steady but laced with ice, "what exactly is the reason for this? What gives you the right to throw me off this flight?" The flight attendant didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened, her arms crossing over her neatly pressed uniform as she tilted her head, looking Pam up and down with something that almost resembled amusement. "I already told you," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with condescension. "We don't serve Republicans on this airline." Pam blinked, momentarily stunned by the blatant discrimination, the sheer audacity of it. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Are you seriously telling me that I'm being removed from this flight because of my political affiliation?" The flight attendant didn't even hesitate. "That's exactly what I'm telling you. We have the right to refuse service, and we choose not to accommodate people like you." Pam could feel her blood boiling. Her entire life had been spent in the public eye, navigating political battles, debates, controversies, but this? This was something else. This was personal. "That's illegal," she snapped, stepping closer, her voice a fierce whisper. "You can't discriminate against passengers based on politics. You have no right to do this." The flight attendant shrugged as if she couldn't care less. "We have the right to ensure the safety and comfort of our passengers, and frankly, someone like you makes people uncomfortable. So, you need to leave." Pam's fingers tightened around her phone, and for a split second, she considered calling someone, her lawyer, the media, anyone who could put an end to this insanity. But before she could act, the security officers moved closer, their presence looming over her, their postures stiff with silent authority. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice neutral but firm, "you need to exit the aircraft immediately." Pam whipped around to face him, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she fought to keep her composure. "And if I don't?" she challenged, refusing to back down. The officer barely blinked. "Then we will be forced to remove you." A tense silence stretched between them. Pam could feel the eyes of passengers watching from inside the plane, their gazes flicking between her and the flight crew, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. No one spoke up. No one defended her. She wasn't surprised. She had seen this kind of passive complicity before, the kind where people knew something was wrong but stayed silent, afraid to get involved. But she wasn't one of those people. She never had been. "This is discrimination," she said through clenched teeth, her voice vibrating with restrained fury. "And I will make sure everyone hears about it." The flight attendant's smirk never wavered. "Do whatever you want. Just do it off my plane." Pam inhaled sharply, her jaw tightening, her fists curling at her sides. For a split second, she debated pushing back harder, refusing to move, making them drag her out so the whole thing would become a public spectacle. But she knew better. She knew when to pick her battles. And this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Slowly, deliberately, she yanked her bag from the overhead compartment, her movements stiff with anger. Without another word, she turned and strode toward the exit, her heart hammering as she stepped back into the jet bridge, her mind already racing with the next steps. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This wasn't just an insult. This was a violation. And she was going to make damn sure the world knew exactly what had happened. Pam Bondi stood her ground, her breathing uneven as the flight attendant's smirk remained unchanged. The injustice of it all burned in her chest like a wildfire. She wasn't just going to walk away, not when she had done nothing wrong. She gripped the strap of her bag tightly, her knuckles turning white, refusing to move. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "You have no right to remove me from this plane. I paid for my ticket. I have every right to be here." The flight attendant let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, as if Pam's resistance was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Then, with a casual flick of her wrist, she signaled to the security officers, who stepped forward with a kind of deliberate slowness that sent a clear message. One way or another, she was getting off this plane. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his voice level, rehearsed, devoid of any real authority beyond the uniform he wore. "You need to leave now." Pam clenched her jaw, refusing to let the anger overtake her judgment. She knew she was right. She knew this was an outrageous abuse of power. And she knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this wasn't about airline policy or safety or any other excuse they wanted to manufacture. This was about politics. It was about silencing voices they didn't agree with. And she wouldn't stand for it. "This is discrimination," she shot back, her voice carrying through the cabin. "You can't throw someone off a flight because of their political affiliation. That's not how this works." The officer, unfazed, simply took another step forward. Pam instinctively stepped back, her heart hammering. The flight attendant didn't even try to hide her amusement now. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like it was some kind of entertainment. Pam's stomach turned. "You're making a mistake," she warned, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "I promise you, this will not end well for you." The officer didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, he reached for her arm, gripping it with just enough force to make it clear that she was out of options. Pam recoiled, jerking away instinctively. "Don't touch me," she snapped, her voice filled with barely restrained fury. But it didn't matter. The second officer moved in, grabbing her other arm, and together they forced her toward the exit. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers whispered to each other, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Others avoided looking at her altogether. Not one of them spoke up. Not one of them intervened. Pam's pulse pounded in her ears as she was dragged down the narrow aisle, her heels scraping against the floor as she struggled to keep her balance. She turned her head, glaring at the flight attendant, who merely raised an eyebrow, looking entirely unbothered. "This isn't over," Pam spat, her voice shaking with rage. "You have no idea what you've just done." And with that, she was shoved through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge, the cold air hitting her like a slap. The officers released her the moment she was off the plane, stepping back as if she were no longer their concern. Pam stumbled forward, catching herself before she could fall. Her hands trembled as she yanked her phone out of her bag, her vision blurring with fury as she scrolled through her contacts. If they thought they could get away with this, they were wrong. So very wrong. She pressed a name on the screen, lifting the phone to her ear. The call rang twice before it was answered. "This is Pam Bondi," she said without preamble, her voice sharp, all business. "I need police at the airport immediately. I was just forcibly removed from a flight for my political affiliation." The person on the other end barely had time to respond before Pam continued, her words clipped, efficient. "Yes, I'll wait right here. This is a violation of my rights, and I will be pressing charges." She hung up before they could say anything else, her hands curling into fists at her sides. Around her, airport staff pretended not to notice what had just happened, their eyes darting away the moment she made eye contact. It was pathetic. It was infuriating. And it would not stand. Minutes later, the sound of approaching footsteps caught her attention. She turned just as two uniformed police officers strode toward her, their expressions unreadable. "Ms. Bondi?" one of them asked, stopping in front of her. "We received a report that you were removed from your flight." "That's right," Pam said, her voice steady now, her anger controlled, channeled. "And I want to file an official complaint. What just happened to me was illegal." The officers exchanged a brief glance before one of them pulled out a notepad. "Can you walk us through exactly what happened?" Pam inhaled deeply, centering herself, then launched into a precise, detailed account of everything: the ticket purchase, the boarding process. The moment the flight attendant targeted her, the blatant admission that they didn't serve Republicans, the humiliation. The security forcibly removing her from her seat despite her doing nothing wrong. The officers listened carefully, jotting down notes, nodding occasionally. When she finished, one of them spoke. "Ms. Bondi, this is a serious allegation. We're going to have to investigate." "I expect nothing less," she said coldly. "And I also expect immediate action. This was blatant political discrimination, and I won't let it go." The officer gave her a small nod. "We'll follow up with the airline and get statements from the staff." "You do that," Pam said. "Because I'll be making sure this goes public. The people responsible for this will face consequences." And she meant every word. Over the next 24 hours, the story exploded. News outlets picked it up almost instantly, headlines plastered across television screens and social media feeds. Former Attorney General Pam Bondi removed from flight over political affiliation, airline under fire for discriminating against conservative passenger. Public outrage erupts after shocking removal of Republican figure from plane. The backlash was swift, relentless. The airline scrambled to contain the damage, issuing vague, half-hearted statements about misunderstandings and internal investigations. But it wasn't enough. Calls flooded into their customer service lines. People canceled flights. Investors started asking questions. And then came the breaking point. Less than a week after the incident, the airline issued a new statement, this one much more direct. "We deeply regret the actions taken against Ms. Bondi and recognize that our staff's behavior was unacceptable. Effective immediately, the employees involved have been terminated. We do not condone discrimination of any kind and are taking steps to ensure an incident like this never happens again." Pam read the statement with a grim sense of satisfaction. But the real surprise came when she received an unexpected call. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of her. "Pam Bondi," she said tersely. A familiar voice hesitated on the other end. "Ms. Bondi, this is the flight attendant from your flight." Pam's eyes narrowed. "Oh? What do you want?" A deep inhale, then, I wanted to apologize. For everything." Pam let the silence stretch, letting the woman squirm on the other end. Finally, she spoke, her voice even. "I hope you learned something from this." The woman exhaled shakily. "I did." Pam nodded to herself. "Good." And then, without another word, she hung up. Justice had been served.